Recording in progress.
Great.
How are you?
So,
How are
Jessica,
things in Florida?
I became familiar with you when we worked on the Uganda project on mini grids for NEROC and USAID.
Yeah.
And I'm so fascinated by your career, and I'm curious as to how you got there. And I looked at your background. I think you went to school here in the US. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm American. I was born in Colorado and I went to school at Syracuse. Did my undergraduate at Syracuse University. Um, my career path is non-linear, that's what I would say. Um,
Okay.
I I moved to Tanzania in my early 20s as a Peace Corps volunteer, and I worked on like small farmer businesses in rural Tanzania for a couple of years, helping build out, you know, more robust rural businesses and SMEs, and helping to provide linkages to farmers to just resources and tools they wouldn't have otherwise had. Um, and then I stayed in Tanzania and I worked in public health for, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, mostly on HIV policy work with the State Department. Um, and in the course of my work with the U.S. government, I sort of realized that I'm private sector oriented. Like I found a lot of the frustrations with working for government entities, not within sort of my interest. And so I pivoted, and I ended up setting up a chocolate company in East Africa. Um, so quite a far left curveball. Um, and and then I did that for a few years, and I did some consulting on the side with that, helping market entry for businesses that were looking at moving into the East African market. And when I sold my
Well,
chocolate company, what?
let's hear a little bit more about that chocolate company. That sounds cool. So, and where was that located?
We were located in Tanzania in Dar es Salaam.
In Tanzania.
Um, yeah, so we were the first bean to bar chocolate producer in East Africa. And I think I sold my shares from the company maybe 7 years ago, something like that. Um, and but yeah, I basically did like a hard pivot in Tanzania. Most of the people that I knew who lived there were entrepreneurs, um, and we had, I had played around with a bunch of different ideas about what I could do professionally in Tanzania that wouldn't be reliant on foreign aid. Essentially, like my family wanted to stay. We were sort of committed to being in Tanzania, and we were looking at business opportunities to anchor into Tanzania. And chocolate seemed both like super fun and interesting, and like learning the chemistry of how you do chocolate, and then building a business. It stoked all the internal entrepreneur in me.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I just returned from Asheville, North Carolina, just for a little vacation. And all the young people there are so entrepreneurial, and that is the way they think. So it's
Yeah.
interesting that you went through that. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, starting your own business is it's something for the young. I would say like
Yes.
it's like a pre-kid. I I loved it, and I loved the first 5 years of business, and most of my career, with the exception of the State Department and U.S. government, was entrepreneurial, running businesses, or consulting for startups or early stage businesses. But I love the first 5 years. It's so much fun, but it doesn't pay very well.
Yes.
And it's pretty high risk. So yeah, I did that, and I sold my shares when my son was about a year and a half. And I did a bunch of consulting in Tanzania, helping businesses start up, like figuring out how to navigate the regulatory structure in Tanzania and the business structure, and looking at market entry for bigger firms. And then on sort of a really big lark, I applied for this position with SunEdison. SunEdison was structuring a joint venture. One of their subsidiaries was structuring a joint venture with a South African firm on rural electrification. And they were looking for a general manager in Tanzania to set up to lead this joint venture. And I had none of the I didn't have a technical background. I was obviously, but I had a business background. And at that point I had run a few different companies, some of my own, some of other people's companies. And I on a lark applied for this position, and they hired me. And at that point, I sort of fell in love with the decentralized energy space. I've spent a number of years in East Africa living off the grid or partially off the grid. And so I think that idea of not being reliant on government services or parastatals in Africa, where the utilities are pretty poor performing, and building out decentralized energy for these communities was like something that just totally clicked with everything that I understood about the communities with which I had lived, and also ticked that like entrepreneurial, like doing something innovative and new part of my soul. And so I worked for the SunEdison CCE joint venture very briefly. SunEdison ended up filing for bankruptcy pretty early on in that joint venture, and the venture fell apart. And then I worked for E.ON's off-grid program in Tanzania as a business development consultant and strategic advisor for just sort of dealing with the politics and policy within Tanzania. And then I was and through that role, I was part of the founding developer team that built AMDA. So I worked with the other 10 developers in East Africa at the time to build up the association. And when my family migrated from East Africa to Europe, I took on a consulting role with them to help build the association, and then ended up staying on as a COO. And then earlier this year, I was promoted to CEO.
So you are now with the Mini-Grid Association?
Yeah.
Okay. And what is your title there?
I'm the CEO.
Okay. And tell us more about this association.
Yeah, so AMDA was built or designed by a collection of private sector mini grid developers in East Africa who were all facing the same challenges in developing and building decentralized infrastructure. A lot of it had to do with regulatory issues and sort of collective problems with the regulatory structure or how that regulation was implemented. And some of those issues were around how concessional money was made available and dispersed. And so collectively, prior to AMDA being an institution, those companies were all working together to sort of push policy and regulatory change. And so we formed AMDA as part of that, as a legal structure that would then allow sort of collective action in advocacy and policy negotiation and improvement in the financial landscape. And so that's sort of where AMDA came from. It's grown a little bit since then. I was the first employee. We're now a full-time equivalent staff of 13 across 6 different countries. But the mission of the organization is to look at how do we build an African decentralized energy market for scale, and how do we move the market away from perpetual pilots of 10 sites or 15 sites or $5 million here, $10 million there, into something that looks like a real utility market where we have long-term debt. The financing that's available looks like infrastructure investments, and where the regulatory structure is matched to the decentralized nature of the sector. I think one of the biggest problems that we see is there's 100 years of an IPP model for energy that all regulation is built on the back of. And that works really well when you're building a 10 megawatt plant or a 100 megawatt plant. But when you're building, 350 kilowatt systems, that structure doesn't work. it's too expensive, it's too burdensome, and it it slows the pace with which we can really build infrastructure. And so a huge part of what AMDA does is works with stakeholders and government and consultants and regulators and donors to think through, like, how do we improve that market so that governments have the oversight that they want, but that we can actually build. Because right now it takes about a year to a year and a half to get through regulatory compliance for a single site. And that's fine. Again, like, it's fine to do a year and a half of feasibility design, pre-development on a on a 50 megawatt hydro facility or on a large scale oil and gas generation facility. But it doesn't make sense if you're only building a 50 kilowatt mini grid. And if you have to do that 18-month process for every single site, you'll just never get to scale. And so the idea behind AMDA is like that collection of thinking on how do we make this better.
Have you been successful in getting any regulatory policy change to help the 50 kilowatt size mini grid?
So we have incremental progress. I think some of it is less in application yet. So we have small wins, like we've been successful in getting tax exemptions for solar goods in Kenya, and we have some successes in the development of the Ugandan regulations and the Zambian regulations, and Kenya and Tanzania in incremental wins in some of the regulatory structure. But none of those are sufficient to get us to actual scale. And one of the things that the sector is going through, and so I think our work is reflected in that, is a few years ago when mini grids were starting to come up, we thought about everything from that really private sector driven, approach where we were supporting government, but it was outside of some sort of public-private partnership or a legal arrangement with the government. And more, there's a recognition that the tender concessional structure is actually what's needed in order to scale. And so where I think we're actually seeing more wins is in newer markets who are thinking about how to actually build out how to build out their energy portfolio more broadly and incorporating decentralized energy into that and thinking about that through the lens of some sort of concessional model. And so, Sierra Leone, which we actually didn't have anything to do with, but the Sierra Leone model is a concessional model which is really working. And concessional models
talk about that model.
Yeah, it's essentially the government went through a feasibility process to determine which sites they wanted to electrify with mini grids, and they tendered out 4 lots in Sierra Leone of roughly 25 sites for each lot. And 3 companies were successful in bidding on those 4 lots and are currently operating about 100 mini grids that they built out over the last 2 years. But what the concession offers, which is similar to what other kinds of concession offers, it provides the government with a level of oversight in where mini grids are being deployed and what the legal requirements for those mini grids are. And then it also provides developers with stability in understanding that they have, a 20-year concession to own and operate those assets in those sites. And it provides, regulatory basically contractually based regulation, which is then scalable. And it provides security. It provides a framework which you could actually build out securities against. So political risk insurance is not available to mini grids in the way that it's available to IPP projects, because there's no contract between the government and the mini grid developer. Concessional model gives you that contract that then you could insure against. So Sierra Leone is sort of, I think, becoming maybe the poster child of how we'd like to see the market succeed. But the sector's in that transition. So I would say up until a year ago, AMDA's focus was on what does the regulation say and incremental changes to the regulation. So portfolio-based approaches to regulatory approval, clarity and simplification of the tariff structures, things like that, where we would see incremental success in the structure of the regulation, but not necessarily the implementation of the regulation. Whereas the concessional model, we're in a transition period where we're advocating for more of that concessional contractual structure. And I think that in the long run, everyone will benefit from that model.
I'm not used to that word, concessional.
I mean, it's subsidization. So well, there's two different ways that it's used. The land concessions, it just provides, it basically is a contract that says that the individual developer has the right to develop that project, and it's a concession that the government is like handing over rights to develop. And in the context of mini grids, it's often regional. So it's a series of locations that allows them to develop, and it provides some security. It provides, a legal framework which says, the developer has exclusivity rights. So if the utility comes, they don't actually have the right to build over the mini grid without compensation. And it provides a legal framework for what's already built into the regulation.
Interesting. Why don't you talk about some of the benefits of mini grids? And I guess we've already heard one of the disadvantages is there's no real governmental process, as you said, for IPPs.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's a bunch of different ways to look at the benefits. The first way, and I think the most important way, is through the lens of the consumer. And in Africa, there are roughly 600 million people who don't have access to electricity. And that's layered on top of public utilities or parastatal utilities that are providing really poor service. And the average utility in Africa is non-solvent. So there's only 2 utilities on the entire continent in sub-Saharan Africa that are solvent. And the quality of power is quite variable, but it's quite bad. And the further away from urban areas you get, the poorer the quality of the power. And so when you think about how do you electrify, how do you provide power to the unelectrified, the quickest, fastest way to do that is through mini grids. And that's a benefit, I think, to government, but from the consumer perspective, it means that they're going to be able to have power much more quickly than if we wait for the grid to arrive. And when they do have mini grid power, it's a stable power supply. So the service level uptime is around 97%. You see less voltage fluctuations in a mini grid than you would see with the national utility often. And there's public data on that service that's available. So from the perspective of the consumer, it's about access to energy as quickly as possible. That's a stable energy source that you can build the back of an economy on. Energy is the foundation for water and sanitation, for education, for healthcare. And without that base of energy, these communities are sort of relegated to early 20th century structures in both healthcare and education and water and sanitation. And so from that perspective, mini grids are extremely important in building out the infrastructure for rural Africans and rural folks across the world who don't have power. From a government perspective, the benefit has a lot to do with financing. They're not responsible for building out the assets, and they're not responsible for the financial outlay of that. And so all of a sudden, the limited national budgets that these governments have to improve their education, improve their roads, all of that, there's never enough money. The budget's there's always more expenditure. They're never able, most governments in Africa are not able to meet the full budget requirements to operate. And so this alleviates financial pressure from the government. Some of the estimates for cost savings to government are in the billions of dollars, leveraging private investment and subsidy money from donors and foundations to build out that infrastructure just alleviates that pressure off the government. And in addition to that, they don't have to continue to think about the long-term operations for those mini grids. So I'll use Tanzania as an example because I just know it much better, but every 3 to 5 years, the parastatal utility is unable to pay many of its bills. And often the World Bank will step in with a low finance debt in order for the utility to continue to operate. And all of that sort of structure, both from the international community and the national government, all of a sudden is just alleviated if the burden for electrification is on private companies.
You've had such an interesting and varied career. I expect that we'll put this interview on Energy Central Forum, and then I'm going to do a write-up, which is my background. I was years ago a reporter. But what tips do you have for people interested in all this clean energy or international work or starting out, just any, ideas that you have for people?
Well, I mean, I think part of that is sort of maybe contextual to age. I think when you're young, if you have the opportunity to take risks, do it, because the ability to take professional and financial risks gets harder the older you get. And so, if you're in your 20s and you're not sure what you want to do, the risk of taking an internship somewhere new or throwing your hat into an emerging market or an emerging industry is much easier than it is when you're 40. And so that, I think, taking that risk early on, I think, is important. And I would say, in my own experience, the ability to take risk and the varied experience has given me a lot of opportunity. And I think that professionally, the more broad the experience base, the more opportunity you have as you grow your career as well. You're less likely to get siloed into particular spaces if you've done things that are quite divergent and give you sort of a broader perspective with which you're viewing whatever the industry is. And I think, with renewables and clean energy, it is an expanding market. Mini grids are very difficult, but broadly, like solar, wind, tidal, hydro, like biogas, these are all expanding markets, not just in developing markets, but in existing markets. And so I think the opportunity is only going to continue to exponentially grow.
Are there any special likes or dislikes that you want to convey? This is an opportunity. Also, I'm going to take a photo of us, so yeah.
Cool. I don't know, likes or dislikes. I think the perspective with which I look at a lot of the mini grid sector and the decentralized energy market is very much through the lens of private sector, and how do you incentivize, and behavioral economics, and how do you incentivize particular behaviors and particular outcomes. And I think, if I were to say where my dislike or my frustration is, I think we improperly incentivize a lot of different aspects of the energy ecosystem. And really the reasons why we invest, why donors invest in traditional utility doesn't have anything to do with the long-term viability of the energy system, what's good for the planet, what's even the most economical or the best for the end consumer. It has to do with country trade and high-level politics between nations. And the incentive structure that's built on the back of that makes it even more difficult to move into a green transition, into innovative technical solutions. into, into a world in which everyone does have access to power, that power is at least partially based on renewable energy, and that we're moving into a pathway that has some more equity around energy access.
Are there any topics you would like to bring up?
I don't know that I have anything specific. I've been in the mini grid decentralized energy space for 5 or 6 years now, and it's hard, like the space is filled with a lot of extremely passionate, bright, wonderful people, and it's just hard. And I'm hopeful, that AMDA is going to be successful in moving the mark on some of the crucial pieces to see scale, and that, in another few years, we're, the things that the sector is frustrated with, and the developer and private sector is frustrated with, are less crucial to the survival of the sector, and they're more frustrations of just running a functional business. And we're not quite there yet. I think the sector is still really fragile, and it's very subjective to the whims of foreign money and national politics, and so, that fragileness is important as we think about, like, how do we move the sector forward, and making sure that those structures are robust and sustainable.
Well, this has been so excellent, Jessica. I really appreciate it. I knew you would be a great interview. I'm not disappointed at all. Well, I will plan to post this, and I will also send you my notes on it, and anything I can do, answer any questions that you have. I'm very active in the Energy Bar Association, and so anyway, someday you may get interested in joining up with us. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Cindy. I'll send you the link to this, because I think it will end up going to the video recording, because I think it will go to my account, but I'll send it to you. It's lovely to see you. And maybe when you send over stuff, could you just send the link to the Energy Bar Association? Because I am really not very familiar at all with domestic energy policy in the US. And so any information you have would be super useful.
I would love to do that. Well, thank you again, Jessica.
Thanks so much, Cindy. Have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.